Assalamu alaikum. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I wish to extend my sincere gratitude to the organizers and to all the parties and partners who have organized this important and significant conference, and also to thank them for allowing me to be with you here today. This is actually my third time to be part of this magnificent conference, which has become one of the most important platforms for holding frank, principled, and human rights-centered discussions and dialogues on human rights, I would say not only in Pakistan, but really the continent. This would not have been possible if it were not for the efforts of particular civil society organizations, including women human rights defenders, including lawyers, including judges, and others, amongst them also victims, who continue to demonstrate really immense courage, intellectual rigor, and commitment to the human rights agenda, often exercised at immense personal risks. And I wish to take this opportunity to pay tribute to them. I've been invited today to address Pakistan's binding international human rights obligations. I'm going to, of course, focus on those obligations as far as they pertain to women and girls that are under Pakistan's jurisdiction. So that also includes non-Pakistani women and girls. And my remarks are going to be grounded really in the concerns that I and other independent experts have raised in recent years through communications and engagements with successive governments of Pakistan. Now, as many of you know, international law recognizes that women and girls are entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms without discrimination, including without discrimination based on sex. And that is reflected in customary law, in international binding instruments, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women and the two covenants. And Pakistan is, of course, a member to all these treaties and has ratified them. And international law also recognizes that women and girls should not have their rights violated. But not only that, in fact, states must also prevent very actively, punish and remedy such violations, including those committed by private actors, and they must address structural discrimination that limits women's participation in all areas of life. It also requires states to adopt proactive measures to achieve substantive equality in law and in practice, including through the adoption of what we call temporary special measures to ensure structural equality. And as you know, they are a set of non-derogable fundamental human rights, meaning that states cannot derogate from these even under emergencies. And women, just like men, are also entitled to the full protection of their non-derogable rights, such as, for example, the right to life, freedom from torture, cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment, as well as freedom from slavery. Now, as I said, I'm going to briefly focus on the areas that we have engaged with the government of Pakistan on. And so the first, I would say, and I know my colleague Gina Romero is going to also speak to that at length, but I would say is the situation of women human rights defenders, particularly those working on enforced disappearance, minority rights, accountability. They continue to face harassment, travel restrictions, criminalization under counterterrorism and public order laws, smear campaigns, physical attacks, forced disappearance, and other reprisals. Another area of concern that has affected women and girls are blasphemy laws and related practices, which continue to expose women and girls, particularly, I would say, from religious minorities, to the risk of mob violence, prolonged detention, family violence, and challenges in access to legal and effective justice. Then we have the whole sphere of security and counterterrorism frameworks that are applicable, particularly in certain regions, I would say, such as Baluchistan, and that also have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. These have included enforced disappearances of them or their relatives, family members, harassment without the ability to seek justice, movement restrictions. They've also experienced internet disruptions and have experienced challenges in accessing education and services. And the application, of course, of this overly broad terrorism definitions have affected their ability to peacefully associate and to organize. I would say also that when it comes to non-Pakistani women, particularly women in need of international protection, particularly Afghan women also, they too must be protected and assisted against discrimination, exploitation, and violence, consistent not only with human rights law, but also refugee law. And it bears emphasis that international law doesn't permit selective protections. And for Afghan women in particular, I would say, and I know Richard will also speak to this, is that where it may appear that they have violated national laws, for example, if they are considered to have been responsible for or committed drug offenses, we have to really look at the power structure within their families. We have to see if they have been able really to make, to take decisions, to take free decisions, if they had information that they needed before we apply also punishments to them. And at any case, and in all circumstances, the principle of non-refoulement applies, which means that they cannot be returned to a place where their life would be in danger. A fifth area is the area of child early and forced marriage, which of course remains to be an area of concern. And here again, I want to say that girls, particularly belonging to religious minorities, are still at risk of forced conversions and forced marriage. And unfortunately, we know that the judiciary and law enforcement at times are complicit and pretend that the girls have done so also voluntarily. So under international human rights law, Pakistan, of course, has committed to prevent child marriage and protecting girls from harmful practices. And it has also taken important legislative and institutional steps towards the prevention and response to violence against women and girls, including also on preventing child marriages. And these are commendable efforts. They need to continue. I mentioned one of them, for example, recently, the Domestic Violence Prevention and Protection Act that was adopted in January 2026 and was enacted for the Islamabad Capital Territory. So all these efforts show that Pakistan is committed and can translate international standards into domestic legal solutions. Of course, the courts and the judiciary are important players in this. So I want to, for example, recognize that in 2025, the Supreme Court recognized psychological, verbal, and emotional abuse as cruelty and grounds for the dissolution of marriage through khula, strengthening legal protections against domestic abuse. Despite these achievements, I think all of us in the room acknowledge that challenges remain. Challenges such as the low reporting and conviction rate for perpetrators of violence, challenges such as continued survivor blaming attitudes, continued reliance on informal mediation in serious cases, and continued limited availability of shelters and services, referral pathways, particularly in rural areas. Now, I will close by reminding ourselves that experience tells us that the best laws on paper remain powerless, remain ineffective if there are not adequate resources to go with it to operationalize those legal and policy frameworks. So I would encourage the government and all Pakistani stakeholders to give teeth to their laws and institutions working on achieving gender equality by resourcing them adequately, and to invest more in education to change harmful social norms and gender stereotypes in line with Article 5 of the CEDAW that requires actually states to modify social and cultural patterns with a view to eliminating prejudices customary, and all forms of practices based on the inferiority or superiority of either males or females. Because violence is never a private matter, never culturally or religiously justified, and it is never inevitable. And fulfilling the international human rights obligations towards its women and girls is fulfilling obligations towards half of society. So that is not nice to have, that is not a luxury, but essential for the prosperity and development of Pakistan and its society. And with that, reassure you again of my continued support, and I'm sure also of my colleagues with me here today. Thank you.